Well, welcome to the second episode of Hired with Styers here with Interview Kickstart. I'd like to introduce Robin. She's going to be joining us today. Been a recruiter for many, many years. Was actually at Amazon for quite a long time. So we're going to dive in a little bit about that today. Robin, we want to go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit. Tell us a little bit about what you've been working on.
Absolutely. I'm Robin Hokinson, and I started at Interview Kickstart in May, and I lead the ML Switch Up program at Interview Kickstart. So I help develop the curriculum and facilitate trainings for engineers that would like to transition into machine learning and AI. So I work on the program, I facilitate trainings, and I also provide some one-on-one coaching as well. But I have a long history of recruiting. I've been recruiting for almost 20 years. Mostly biotech and tech. So I worked at smaller startup biotechs and larger biotechs. I've led teams. I focused primarily the latter half of my career on executive recruiting and then managing teams in addition to that. So when I was at Amazon, I focused on hiring executive engineers and scientists at the L7 plus level. So really focus on ML, AI, robotics, anything in that innovative tech space.
Excellent. Now, how long were you there at Amazon?
For about 4 years.
Wow, that's a good time at Amazon. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean it's great to talk to other recruiters that worked at Faang companies. Like myself, I worked at Facebook for several years on the iOS side of that, and so it's great to kind of dive into a little bit about the world and some of these Faang companies. Sometimes are very difficult to get into, and not as easy to stay into as well. It's not for everybody. And so I want to dive into a little bit about your experience there, at Amazon. So can you talk to me just a little bit about, what it was like to work at Amazon, number one, and then what was your interview process specifically for on the recruiting side? Because I'm actually kind of curious on both what it was like as a recruiter interviewing, but also on the engineering side, because we get a little bit of different experiences there.
Absolutely. Well, it was a great experience. So, I provided all of the hiring for executive levels within the devices and consumer organization. So, partnering with leaders, even the chief scientist at Amazon, it was a really great experience to work with that. I built a 3-year plan, a lot of learning. So, this was a new domain for me when I joined Amazon. Actually, came in through a referral, someone who used to be previously on my team, so learning about all of the nuances of ML, AI, how does that integrate into the products? And then
Mhm.
also understanding, not only understanding the business and what the business is trying to achieve, but what's the right phenotype from a candidate perspective? And then how to engage those candidates over a long period of time. And then I spent a lot of time prepping my candidates because the interview process is very intense at Amazon. So I would spend at least an hour prep session to make sure that the candidates were set up for success. They knew exactly what to expect, familiarity in all of the elements of the interview, and following them through the entire process, in addition to interviewing them, then the debrief and offer negotiation, and being able to explain the compensation package and help negotiate on their behalf as well.
Oh wow,
But
that's a
overall,
lot.
great experience, a lot of learnings, failures along the way, worked with an amazing team, loved just learning about all the new innovative products that were coming to market, and fast-paced environment, definitely, very driven, high bar, a lot of high expectations, not only of myself, my team, as well as the candidates once they come in, making sure that they're able to execute and deliver and also help build that strategy for the organization.
All right, excellent. And so you spent like a full hour prepping candidates for these interviews. Could you maybe go into a little bit about some of those tips and tricks that you would give your candidates before they
Yeah.
go into the interview process?
Yeah. So what we're looking for from a recruiter perspective is we're looking for a candidate that is able to provide an impact. So somewhere in their past experience, they made an impact that's long lasting. It's whether it's developing an algorithm or something that other people are using. So they're not only impacting themselves, but also their team and then the organization and thinking about the customers. So Amazon is very customer centric. So one of the leadership principles is customer obsession. So, making sure first and foremost that the candidates are familiar with the leadership principles. So there are 16 leadership principles. You can easily find those online. But there were 14 at the time, and then we added a couple more leadership principles. So that really embodies the culture and the values of Amazon. So making sure that candidates do well on the leadership principles, and those are going to be behavioral based questions. And then there's the technical aspect, which I'm not an engineer, so I leaned on the scientists and engineers to really assess the technical piece. So whether that's coding, problem solving, some kind of analysis, system design, that's going to be another component of the interview. And then in addition to that, it's really being about, what's the scale and scope of the work that they've done. So being able to leverage their experience and be able to scale at, the Amazon level. The other thing that the hiring manager and the team is always looking for is trying to assess the level. So the difference between an L5, L6, L7, L8, that's part of the interview. So you might be interviewing for a role that's an L7. It's possible that you might come back with an offer at the L6 that gives you that opportunity to come in and demonstrate the work that you can do and move up to that next level.
That's great. You're talking about the scalability of some of these positions because again, just a reminder for everybody, this is at like L7, this is the executive level. And so, and a lot of folks don't understand that because, as you move up in some of these organizations, they actually split it into two different directions, right? You can stay the technical track or you can go the management track, right? So this way it gives people opportunity to continue moving in their career. And so what a lot of folks don't understand when it comes to moving into a higher level position, where there's from like senior to staff to principal, on up, it's about understanding the scale of the work that you could do because your technical abilities are only going to go so far, but having to be
Mhm.
able to take it to scale is a whole different ball game. And so this is where it comes to play of like understanding who it is that you're interviewing with and being able to put yourself into this position and just showcasing that you can do it at that level, even if you maybe not have done it, but being able to show that you can do that. So that's a fantastic point. I mean, a lot of folks really kind of miss out on that scalability piece.
Yeah, and they're looking for that potential. So even if there aren't a lot of companies the size of Amazon, obviously, but if you've demonstrated that you have that potential to work at that scale, then the company will, sometimes take a chance and make sure that, hey, we're going to mitigate any risks or set you up with a mentor or make sure you have additional training and things like that, so you can be set up for success in that type of role. One of the tips that I always tell candidates is think about your top 4 or 5 really strong examples that you can talk about. So these are stories, and I know we'll get into the behavioral interview training, but you don't have to think of answers to every single leadership principle. If you can incorporate a number of leadership principles into your examples, so think of something that's really robust, where you've had a problem that you had to solve. How did you go about solving that problem? What were the results? And then thinking about reflections. Now, Amazon really embraces failure and learnings along the way. So you always want to end your answer with, hey, what did I learn from that experience? What would I have done differently? And be self-reflective. They use the term vocally self-critical. So being able to be humble and say, if I could do it again, I would have taken maybe this different approach. And that's okay. That's okay to demonstrate that you're human and you've made mistakes and you've learned along the way.
That's a great point, and that's for any interview that you go into. You want to think about the stuff that you've done in the past. There's always that, hindsight being 2020, going back and actually looking about it. Okay, I've done it this way, but along the road, you've gained more experience. You see things a little bit differently these days, and so not only talking about the stuff you've done, but how would you do it now? Really showcase your ability to learn, adapt to new situations, but also just grow as in your career because we're going to constantly learn new things, and that's
Mhm.
inevitable, but being able to demonstrate that in an interview and looking back saying like, yeah, maybe that wasn't the best approach to that, but I know that now. And
Mhm.
this is why it's huge, big difference between like education and actual experience itself. Going
Mhm.
through the actual steps of these situations really puts things in a little bit more perspective sometimes. No, that's
Mhm.
fantastic. And so when we're thinking about some of these leadership principles, that is a lot to memorize. Like I remember interviewing for Amazon years and years ago. Come to find out, I wasn't really I wasn't ready to move to Seattle at that time.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was definitely an experience. And I remember like reading, and it was 14 principles back then, and I remember
Mhm.
memorizing them all. And I love the fact that you mentioned using those in like using a couple in each of your examples. I mean, it's tough to come think of an example for each one of those and then try to understand which one they're trying to ask during that interview. Now, do they actually have an idea of what specific principles they're going to ask in each one of those interviews, or is it just
They
going to
do.
be kind of like
Yeah.
they do? Okay, how does
No,
that
the
typically
recruiter
break down?
yeah, typically the recruiter will really drive the interview process with the interview team. So we would put together a pre-brief, which is a candidate overview. So it talks a little bit about, what are the candidate's profile, bio, what are the strengths, what are the things that the team needs to probe further? Like maybe they don't have enough data on a specific area. So let's make sure we incorporate that into the interview. And we'll have a call. Usually it's about 30 to 45 minutes with the entire interview team. We walk through each of those assessments and those assignments, and we talk through to make sure everybody's aligned and on the same page prior to the candidate going into interview. Sometimes within the job descriptions, there are certain nuances that it gives the hiring manager an opportunity to talk a little bit about that. Like, hey, I actually, if there's someone who is really science, but they have a really strong engineering chops, like that's type of person, that hybrid scientist engineer, just little things that may not be incorporated into the job description. So once the interview happens, the entire interview team is fully aligned. They will know exactly what those leadership principles are that each person's assessing. Now each person will probably assess two um, leadership principles and then may have one other technical question, or they might dive into another competency. So it could be their engineering depth, breadth, system design and integration, being able to solve real world problems. These are some of the examples that I've had the interview teams assess as well. Now, recruiter, I'll focus mostly on maybe two or three leadership principles, but the interviews are about an hour long. And there are a lot of probing questions as part of the interview questions.
Okay, gotcha. Now, at any point in time, do you actually communicate with the candidates on which possible like principles might be in each one of those interviews?
Yeah, so it's really it depends on the recruiter. I am a big believer in transparency and I like to give them some kind of indication of what each person is going to be covering. I've heard some other things where they said, well, we don't want to give them the answers. And I kind of push back a little bit because if you're not giving them the answers, they're thinking about the example, but they have an indication of what each person is going to be covering. And I want to make sure that they are prepared for each of those interviewers. So I will definitely give the candidate a hint to say, hey, this person is really deep in science. Like, really good chance they're going to go into dive deep into your science or engineering depth. So I really do try to give them that, a color around each of the interviewers. Like if they're a VP that's interviewing them, hey, they're probably going to be looking for more of like think big and more of the breadth and scope. And, could you work in other groups? Could you have an impact outside of the current organization? So I definitely try to give them as many tips and feedback and suggestions as possible. So they go in, they know exactly what to expect.
No, that's great. I mean, it's one of the things I like talking about because, a lot of folks don't understand so much on the recruiting side. And it's kind of weird because, well, one of the things I like to talk about is like after you pass like the recruiter screen, we're on your side. I mean, we
Yeah.
want you to get the at this point in time. And things that folks have to understand is like, I like to put it like recruiters, we're kind of like the salespeople of the HR world, right? We have
Mhm.
metrics, we have goals. We actually have like, we have to have so many hires in a quarter. Like we actually have very similar sales goals. We get performance bonus based on some of that stuff too. And so when it comes to, moving on through that process, it's really important to talk to the recruiter about what to expect in those interviews once you're moving on to that next stage. Because at that
Mhm.
point in time, we're your ally. Like we're your
Yeah. Yeah.
advocate throughout this process, whether it's helping you prepare for the interview, whether it's helping offer negotiations. I mean, we at the end of the day, we want you to sign a contract. So we're going to do anything we can within reason, ethically, making sure we're not crossing any boundaries there. But we like to help out. We want to make sure that you're prepared as much as possible for some of these interviews. And so
Yeah.
it's really to like build a good solid relationship with your recruiter. I mean, if they're going to be helping you out, you want them in your corner. They're not against you. They're there to help you out. And so a lot of
Yeah.
folks don't understand that and the importance of that relationship with the recruiter. So the better you can build that relationship and gather that information, the more the better you're going to be prepared for this. Now, like you mentioned, not every recruiter is going to do the same thing. Everybody's got different experience, and they're coming from different places, and not everybody's going to be exactly the same. But at the end of the day, we still want to help you out, the best we can. That's why we got into this too, you know. And so, like, really kind of going into like the next step of this. I mean, when it comes to like when I was at Facebook, it's a little bit different. Again, when I was at Meta, this is about 6 or 7 years ago, and this could be completely different. But I used to prep my candidates, almost the same way. I probably wouldn't spend as much time on that, but darn close to it. I mean, but I think the way our interview process mapped out was like in three different parts. We would have a Jedi, a pirate, and a ninja interview, and each one of those had specific things they were looking for. Like I think and again, this is a long time ago, so I could be wrong. It's been a little bit, but if I remember correctly, the Jedi interview was going to be more of like your behavioral questions. Your
Mhm.
ninja interview is going to be your coding interviews, like your technical interviews. So usually there's like two of those depending on what job you're doing on, and then the pirate interview is going to be your system design. So each one of those had specific things that they are cover. And I think I remember saying more than anything is like data structures and algorithms. Now, I was mostly focusing on iOS engineers at the time, and my goodness, if I say data structures and algorithm, I get kind of like the hair standing up back on my neck. I think I've said it so many times. But sometimes it's about getting back to the fundamentals of things to prepare for some of these interviews, especially at some of these FANG companies. Those fundamentals that you learn doing getting your CS degree really comes into play in some of this. And a lot of folks have it's been a little while since you've done that.
Yeah.
And so it's a to go back to those fundamentals and kind of train back up on that. Go back through some of those data trees and things of that sort. Because again, it's just that foundation stuff that they're looking for, and then the other stuff is going to come along with that. Good.
Mhm.
And so, when it comes to some of these leadership principles, I mean, when you're combining a couple of these, again, when you're going into, do you sometimes know, I guess like you would know, but the candidates, I mean, depending on how they ask the question, is it relevant? I mean, is it easy to tell what they're trying to get out of that, or is it just kind of like a guessing game sometimes?
I think they can definitely interpret some of those questions and say, hey, oh, I can tell they're diving deep or they're focusing on customer obsession. You could get a sense of that. I will say one of the leadership principles where people get a little bit caught up on is disagree and commit. So sometimes they'll talk about how they had a conflict and then it was successful. And what Amazon is looking for is when maybe you didn't agree with an approach or a solution, and you said, okay, you know what? I don't agree, but I'm going to commit to putting my best foot forward and being successful within your process or what you suggest. So that is one that I will share that sometimes candidates, and I always call that out in the interview prep. Hey, it's not necessarily about how you were able to influence and get someone to follow your solution. It's about you following another solution where you didn't necessarily agree that was the best approach. So I just wanted to call that one out. That can get people a little bit confused. But it's really storytelling. It's talking about like the STAR method, situation, task, action, result, and then reflections. Actually add that another R to the end of that too. But you can really kind of tell like which principle, if they're thinking broader, then it's probably think big, or if they're talking about how did the work that you do impact the customer, you can guarantee that that's probably customer obsession.
All right, good. Now, so you're saying for that specific example, they're looking for when you've actually followed along with something you disagreed with. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. And you
Wow, I
said,
would have missed that.
I'm going to put my own beliefs aside and we'll try this your way. And you are fully supportive of that person. So that's one that can be a little bit challenging. And there will be questions about influencing. There's going to be questions about not only influencing your teams, but influencing above. So influencing VPs and above, influencing across, and influencing below without authority. So guarantee that they're going to talk about how do you go about influencing others to follow your solution or whatever direction you want to go.
That's great. No, I appreciate you bringing that up because that would definitely stump a lot of folks out there. I mean, I definitely read it the different way too, because I'm like, oh, I can push back on like, okay, this is how I think we should do it, and this is why. Here's my data. Let's do it.
Yeah.
But it's also there are a lot of times like you don't know everything, and it's important to say, okay, this person has a direction with they're going to this, and I may not have the full plan, so I need to come in with saying, all right, let's do it. I may not agree with it, but you know what you're talking
Mhm.
about? Let's go 100%. Let's make it happen.
Yeah,
Sometimes
I
we
mean,
have to do.
I'll share an example of just from a recruiting perspective. We ended up hiring someone in a different job family. So initially, we were interviewing the candidate for an applied science. The team felt person was stronger on the research side. I felt like, shared my data to try to influence, and ultimately we ended up hiring them in the research scientist role. And so I said, okay, I support you. We'll do everything to make sure this person is set up for success. And so that would be an example. You push back, you shared your data, you tried to influence, and then ultimately you followed the direction of someone that had a difference of opinion.
All right, good. And so thinking about like the communication with the recruiter. I mean, especially once you've already passed that interview, like I said, we're like that ally piece there. So when you're thinking about the communication with the recruiter, like what is your best advice for candidates to not only be engaging with the recruiter, being respectful, but also, making sure you're not getting lost in the weeds?
Yeah. I mean, I always tell candidates to follow up with me. Don't feel like you're bothering me. If you want to check in a week, obviously, if I have information, I will share that. But I think it's important to continue to communicate, especially if you have other offers, other activity that's time sensitive, making sure you're very transparent with the recruiter about anything else that you have going on. So then we can advocate for you and push things further along or sooner, try to move the interview up. We want to make sure that we're not losing the candidate to other offers. We want to have that opportunity for you to interview with us. So please be transparent on any other activity that you have. We talk a lot about compensation. And so thinking about compensation expectations, no, we're not asking you your current compensation. A lot of states, you can't do that. And
Right.
that's fine. We just really want to know your expectations. And I tend to ask that on the front end just to understand, like, what is the ballpark that you're looking for so we don't get further down the process and we're not fully aligned. So really be transparent. Like you said, Chris, like the recruiter is your advocate. Like we're going to fight for you. And if you're a little bit outside the range, we'll work with you on that. We'll talk through, we'll try do our best to build a business case. If we are you're outside the range, sometimes we can push the hiring managers a little bit if we have a really strong case. But I think being really transparent, communicating anything else, don't be afraid to ask questions. Really try to understand the business and the teams, and also do your research. There's a lot of information on the internet about how to interview at Amazon. You can look up behavioral interview questions, really prepare. The other thing I'd like to add is that at Amazon, typically at the L7 plus level, you do have to submit a writing sample. So
Oh,
usually there are a couple of questions that you can answer. You'll have those questions ahead of time. And then the writing sample will be 2 to 3 pages. So it could be something like the most innovative thing you've done. There are a couple of different questions to choose from. So you'll have the writing sample, and then at times you'll have a tech talk. So you'll actually present to a group of not only the interviewers, but a broader audience. So this is your opportunity to develop a rapport, not only with the interview team, but other people within the organization. And you can showcase your ability and some of the work that you've done within the team. So then they go into the interview, they kind of have a background a little bit more on what you've done, or maybe you solved a really difficult problem. You may already have a presentation that you could present, and that's great. You can certainly reuse that if you're comfortable with it. So it might not have to be something that you create from scratch. If you have something that's public information, then you can certainly present on that.
Yeah, just don't use Chat GPT.
Just don't use ChatGPT.
Yeah, we don't want to do that. Oh, that's good. And yeah, I didn't realize they had like presentations like that, but it actually makes sense. I mean, because as you are moving up in these different levels, L7 above, like even just a pure IC technical role, you're still going to have to influence others, and you're still going to have to present data and be comfortable with talking to multiple folks at the same time and present your information, present your findings, or why we need to do something. So it's a skill you've got to have. And if you're not comfortable with public speaking, you're gonna need to get comfortable quick.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
it's a little what interviews are. You mentioned this before in the past. I mean, it's about telling good stories. I mean, anybody who's doing any behavioral interviewing, it's just telling good stories. And the more comfortable you are about speaking into folks that you've never met before, I know it's not for everybody. We have a lot of introverts that are in the engineering world there, and it's not easy to do. You know, this is where repetition and this is where doing it more often, getting yourself outside of that comfort zone is really going to help make you more comfortable the more often you do it. Now, I want to circle a
Yeah.
little bit back to the compensation stuff you're talking about. I love talking about this. I mean, not every recruiter is going to bring up compensation in the very beginning. I've been doing it from the very beginning since day one, and I will never change that because, like you
Me
mentioned,
too. Yeah.
we don't want to get to the end of this and we're on two different planets. It's happened before in the past. You know, if you've been doing this long enough, you've been burned by that once and you're never going to make that mistake again. And so, and you're right, when we talk about, we're asking for what are your expectations, right? We can't ask what is your current compensation. If any recruiter asks what your current compensation is, if it's keep in mind, if it's a position that they're hiring globally, they cannot ask that because I think it's like 27 states or something like that where it is illegal to ask that, So we're looking for your expectations. And this is where doing good research helps you understand where you are in the market, right? Having gone through several interviews will give you an idea of where not only your skill is, but also where the market's at, because that does change quite often, especially now that we're in a very competitive job market right now. Those rates might change. The expectations might be higher and the compensation might be a little bit lower. So it just really depends on the role. So it comes with gathering data. There's a lot of really good resources out there to understand where compensation's at, especially for large companies. Tons of people post that information. You can find that stuff on like Team Blind. You've got levels.fyi, Glassdoor, all kinds of different resources to find out where those compensation ranges are at. Now, I always like trying to get an idea when it comes to talking about comp is understanding what is your base salary. Like, I don't want to go any less than this base. I mean, that number right there is like, this is what I need to live day to day. Then you have your
Mhm.
total compensation number, which this is going to be a combination of your base salary, your bonus, your equity. Now, we could also include just kind of like the benefits and stuff like that, but when we're calculating the actual dollar value, it's really going to be based off of those three things. And so you
Mhm.
want to have a base number you're trying to go at to whatever your target total compensation number is. Because as a recruiter, we have a lot of like areas that we could move that needle in some specific places to help bridge that gap. So for an example, if you're looking for a base salary of 250,000, well, this position I can only, where we're coming in at maybe like 230, but I'm going to give
Mhm.
you a $40,000 sign-on bonus to bridge that gap for 2 years. So this way you'll be up to where you need to. So there's some things that we
Mhm.
could do to help bridge that gap, but the more information we have on comp in the beginning helps us plan a little bit better. Like you mentioned, we're able to actually talk to the hiring team to say, all right, this person's going to be at this level. We're going to have to either go to the next level up, go outside our pay bands, because what a lot of
Mhm.
folks don't understand is kind of how we look at compensation. Not every company is going to be exactly like this, but we typically have like a range. So like within like for like an L7, we have a 0 to 100%. Now in that band, our target's about 50% is where we want to try to bring everybody in at for the most part, depending on how well you interviewed. Now it could be right around the 25%. If you didn't do quite well, maybe your votes weren't all there, but you still did okay in the interview. We might come in a little bit lower. Or if you did quite well, we'll be at the 75%. Now we have to
Mhm.
get special approval to go over that 75% because now we're getting into that range where it overlaps to that next level up, right? And
Mhm.
so sometimes we have to get that approval to make sure we could do that. Or if they did well enough in the interview, let's hire them at an L8. Let's go to the next level
Mhm.
up. And this is for any level that's out there. And so having a good understanding of compensation lets us know, making sure we're interviewing for the right position. Because if you
Yeah.
go through the whole interview process, let's say at an E3, right? But where your compensation was actually at an E4 setting, we just wasted everybody's time, right? Maybe
Yeah.
you qualified for
Yeah.
the E3, you might have done okay at the E4 interview, but we won't know. So having those
Yeah.
conversations early on for these positions are great. And sometimes if you ask us like, what is the range for this position? Well, sometimes we really don't have a range. So if we're like, I remember when I was at Meta, I could hire anything from an E3 to an E7. No, E2 to an E6. I'm sorry. And that's a pretty big range. So if I'm like, well, I could hire from this number to this number, it's like, well, it
Yeah,
just depends on where you want to be at and where your skills are. Now, I might have a general idea based on your experience where you might fall in line with, but it's not guaranteed. It depends on what your expectations are and your abilities to be at. So having
yeah,
that knowledge coming into that conversation is really going to give you a leg up when it comes to offer negotiations because that starts day one. Your first
yeah.
conversation, talk about comp, that starts right then. But what you mentioned earlier about talking or staying in contact with a recruiter, especially if you have like other offers or other interviews that are coming up, the same thing can be said about compensation. So let's say in the first conversation, you said your expectations were this number. Well, maybe you've been on a couple other interviews, and we might be a little bit, you might have undervalued yourself in that initial conversation because these other interviews you're doing well in, they're paying more. Let us know saying, "Hey, I've
Mhm.
been on a couple of their interviews. I think I was a little bit off on what the market was looking like. These are the companies I'm talking to. This is where the comp is at. Is this going to be something that's realistic for this position?" We could go into that conversation there. But the sooner you could do that with us, the better we could help you out on the back end of that, especially if we need to add an additional interview to this. Because I remember if it was from like going from an E4 to an E5 at Meta, we would add an additional pirate interview to that. So it's an additional system design interview, or maybe it's another behavioral interview, depending on what they're doing. So this way we can gather that additional skills. And sometimes we need to know that if we're going to be hitting that level when it comes to compensation.
Yeah, and also thinking about the offer process. So, if it's higher in the range, know that it could take a lot of time to go through those approvals. The recruiter will need to write even on any offer, they have to write a really strong business case that goes to several different levels to get those approvals. So, no, it could take time. So, it's better that we know up front if you're really looking for a little bit higher, like let's go in at that and put our best foot forward and see if we can try to get that versus we don't want to negotiate a million times after everything is approved because then it has to go through all those steps again. So if anything changes along the way, make sure that you communicate with a recruiter and you're very transparent. We want to be really transparent with you. It should go both ways.
Absolutely. And even talking about what you mentioned about again communication about other interviews and things of this sort, because again, it's competitive out there. Like we want you to work for us, of course,
Mhm.
as a recruiter, we're trying to get the deal done too. So we could keep both of that stuff in mind. But if you have another interview lined up or you're getting close to an offer stage, if you let us know, you'd be surprised on the mountains we can move. It's a little bit harder to do at some of the larger FANG companies. I've been working at a lot of startups recently, and I actually had someone for like it was a group product manager, and I talked to them on a Thursday. I had an offer Friday afternoon, and they had to go through 5 rounds of interviews. But we were right at the offer stage for somebody else. They were at an offer stage with another company, and so I had to make it happen in a day and a half. And so I was able to get everybody together, get everybody on board. This candidate was perfect. My goodness, it was like the purple squirrel of our world.
That's
Unfortunately, the other
amazing.
company still beat
Like
us
that's
out.
such a quick turnaround.
Oh, it's not easy, but those things. I mean, it's a little bit easier for a startup to kind of move some of those things around. Or even when I was at Indeed, I was still able to make some crazy things happen like that. I mean, I've got someone from an offer, from initial recruiter screen to offer in like 5 days. It's absolutely possible to do that. Just work with us. Let us know what's going on. The more information you can give us to help you out, we will definitely do that. Right. So building that relationship is very important. Now, you
Absolutely.
talked a little bit about going through this. Now, I know at Meta we're able to up level positions or like the bar raiser. So, what was that like
Mhm.
there at Amazon?
I would say that there was probably more instances where candidates were down leveled than up leveled necessarily. But
Oh
there
yeah.
are times that we will present a candidate and we want to make sure we are bringing them in the right level. So there are times that I said, hey, this candidate has this, this, and this. And I wrote a business case to say, before we interview, I do think that this candidate, we should go up to the L8 level. Because it takes a while to get promoted, going through that whole process. So we want to make sure they're coming in at that right level. So going through different approvals, and that's where I use my influence with VPs to say, here's why we need to bring this candidate at this level. Does the business support this? Because if it doesn't make sense to bring someone in at an L7 when the role really is an L6, it's not going to be doing anyone favors. It's not going to be doing the business favors. The candidate isn't going to feel, it's not going to be the right level for the candidate. Maybe they're not feeling challenged. So, yeah, I would say most likely, down, sometimes it's down leveled. Rare. I mean, my advice is always to up level the position before we even have the candidate go through the screenings, rather than after the debrief and the interview. It's much more tricky to make that change in the end.
Yeah.
So less likely that they would get up leveled in the end, more likely, hey, we just didn't see enough um, of the candidate demonstrating at the L7 or L8 level. We'd actually like to bring them in as an L6 and give them that opportunity to learn and be able to demonstrate their ability.
Yeah, we see that happen a lot more often, definitely going the other direction. I mean, every company that I've been at always has a little bit of a different, I would say, grading when it comes to these interviews, whether it's they use like a number point system or if it's like a, definite yes or definite no or any of those different types of things. And each one of those could actually affect the interview, whether it's going to be down leveled or rejected flat out. I mean, I've been at I can't remember what company it was at, but we actually had like a number rating per vote. So it was like a definite no was a -4 and a no was a -2, and then like your yes was a +1, your definite yes was a +2. So if you had a definite no, that almost like destroyed the entire interview. But if you had a couple, if you maybe had one no and you're still in the positive, then yes, we could
Mhm,
move forward with an actual yes or even down level some of that position. So being down level doesn't mean that you weren't any good or anything like that. You just have to
mhm,
understand like each company is going to be a little bit different in those expectations. And if you haven't worked for like a FANG company before or a company a size of like Meta or Amazon, it's going to be pretty common that you do get down level to that just because of the sheer size and scope of what you're going to be working on. And it's a little bit of a different environment. So there is going to be a bit of a learning curve there. Now with Amazon, I know typically for your more executive level positions, your L7s, L6, L7s, you actually have one position that you're trying to hire. Now, when I was at Meta, I was hiring again, of course, everything. And so we didn't actually have specific teams that people would get hired into.
mhm,
A very structured interview, regardless of what team you might go to. Now, this they had like, it was like Instagram, you had WhatsApp, you had the Facebook app, then you had the Oculus. Now, Oculus, it was like its own separate interview process, but everything else followed the exact same interview. Then you'd go into a boot camp where you would actually learn how they do everything. It was a long boot camp. And then after boot camp is when you go to team matching. Now, some companies that do it where they might do team matching right after the interview. At Indeed, for some of the data scientists and research scientists we hired, we would do the team matching after the interview once they've got hired, depending on who's hiring right now. You go through some separate interviews from there. What was it like there at Amazon when it came to team matching?
Yeah, I mean, we would identify specific teams. So it wasn't like a candidate went through the process and then we figure out what team they're going to go on. They would know this going into the interview. But there are times when a candidate has fungible skills and could be a fit for a couple different organizations, and that's what we would call a split loop. So they would interview with a few folks from, say, devices and a few people from consumer. And then at the end, we would set up a call with both hiring managers to walk them through the different roles and different teams. And then it's really up to the candidate, which team they would be most interested in if they were inclined for both groups. So now they could come back saying, well, this organization wants to move forward, this other organization doesn't want to move forward. And then it's the candidate's decision at that point. But if both teams want to move forward, we want to do what's in the best interest of the candidate and decide which team is going to be the best fit for them. And I would set up as many calls as the candidate would like to be comfortable with each of those teams. Hiring managers, they could talk to people on the team, to make sure they're making the right decision.
Now, was that for like every position, even like suite roles? Now, I'm not sure. Like, I know when I was at Meta, I was very siloed into iOS, and I knew a little bit about what's going to Android, but I had no idea what else was happening else in the organization. Like, I didn't know any other interview processes. I know for us, we were very siloed in what we're doing on. Now, was that for just your executive level positions, or was that across the board for all roles?
Yeah, it was across the board. Are you talking about in terms of knowing what team they're going to be working on? Or are you thinking about like split loops and interviewing for multiple positions?
So I'm thinking about like what team they're going to be going to. So I know for a lot of
Yeah.
times for like sweet positions like software engineers, usually you're just going to keep on interviewing folks and they're going to go through a certain panel for that. But do we know who the hiring manager is going to be at the beginning of the interview process?
Yeah. They do, unless something changes within the business. So there are moments where maybe a position is put on hold and then we try to find another home for the candidate, but they would know what team they're going to be interviewing for. So it's not like you go through just kind of a standard interview and there's a committee and they pick you for a team. You would know that going into the interview exactly what team, who the hiring manager is. So there wouldn't be any like surprises at the end of the interview.
Good. I like that. I really do. I mean, that was always kind of the tricky thing because I know for myself, like I want to be able to talk to who my reporting manager is.
Yeah,
A lot of times I tell my candidates that I go through my interview process, like I want you to interview us as much as we interview you. And it's kind of tough to do
absolutely.
that if you don't know who you're going to be reporting to. So I love the fact they
Yeah.
do that, but that just goes to show you, like, regardless of the company, the interviews are going to be completely different. The process is going to be completely different. So it's important to know going into this to have zero expectations of what you think might happen. The only
Mhm.
person who's really going to know what to expect out of that interview is going to be that recruiter. And again, like that recruiter may not know what the other process is going to be like. Like I mentioned, I was just doing iOS recruiting, and if you reached out to me for like a software engineering role, I wouldn't be able to help you. I've got no idea what that interview is going to look like, right? So it's kind of tough to know that, but it's good to see that there's a lot of diversity when it comes to these interviews and what to expect in some of that. So, and I know this was a little bit different at Meta there. So one of the things that we had there is called rules of engagement. This is something I kind of like to talk about a bit because a lot of folks out there don't understand this piece, and if you understand it, it really helps you understand how that communication works and why we do a lot of the things that we do. Now, I know for Meta and a lot of other companies I've worked at, we have rules of engagement to make sure that there's not a lot of overlap to it. You're not getting harassed by like 1,000 recruiters for the same position. This is a rules of engagement is where we have one recruiter like picks up a candidate and they get to claim them in their ROE, the rules of engagement. So this way you have one point of contact as you're going through that process. Main point of the purpose of this is, let's say for an example, you're a software engineer at Google for the last 5 years. Well, you're going to have probably how many recruiters we have at Amazon and Meta, probably like 5,000, that's too much, maybe
Yeah, a
2,500
lot.
recruiters. There's a lot, right? So you're going to have
Mhm.
2,500 recruiters trying to source you and send you a bunch of messages at the same time, and you're going to lose your mind. But it's a way to actually prevent from like harassing and things like that. But it keeps things a little bit more organized. People aren't stepping on their toes, but it's a way to understand who that specific point of contact is. And so the reason I bring this up is when it comes to communicating with that specific recruiter, you want to make sure that you're keeping that communication going. So I know for us, and again, this has probably changed in the last 6 years that I've been there, but we had to follow a specific cadence in order to, I would say, keep that candidate claimed for the most part. So we would actually, we would have to reach out to them. You would have to send another message within 2 weeks, another message within a month, and we had to follow a specific cadence when we're reaching out to folks, whether it's messages on LinkedIn, on email, however it is, we had to show that we're actually, trying to engage with you. Now, once you've actually responded back to us, that resets that specific number. Now it's changed a little bit. I mean, back in the day, it was you have to claim them for a full year. Then it was like 6 months, and then it changes quite often on some of this stuff. But ultimately, it's meant to try to make sure that you have a good candidate experience, and you're not just kind of being farmed out to like everybody. So there's a little bit of a combination with that. And the reason I like bring it up because you might get reached out to by recruiters from these FANG companies, and you're like, well, I'm not looking for a job right now. I'm not going to respond back. Well, I encourage you to respond back because you never know, but it also gives you an opportunity to now you have a specific point of contact as long as that recruiter is working there, right? So if they reach out to you, it's like, just respond back, something simple. It's like, hey, I'm not exactly in the market right now, but follow up with me in 6 months. We'll set a reminder in our, in our applicant tracking system. It'll automatically send you a message. But the more you keep in contact with this, the better chances when you are looking, you now have a person you could directly reach out to versus blindly applying to jobs and hoping that to work out. But it gets a little
Mhm.
tricky when it comes to knowing, like, especially if you're doing the split level positions or you're trying to interview for different departments, it's important to communicate saying, hey, I'm already interviewing with this position here, right? So this way you're not stepping anybody's toes. They could actually help navigate those conversations a little bit easier because we can see everything in our applicant tracking system and how this stuff works. So we really want to kind of keep that in mind. And I like talking about it because people just don't know some of this, and it helps you kind of get ahead on some of that. Now, what was it like there with Amazon's rules of engagement?
Yeah, I would say, similar. We would have a database, so we would be able to see, look up the candidate before engaging with the candidate. But I always encourage my team to speak with that recruiter, even if they spoke with that candidate a year ago, just to get some backstory and understand, maybe what's driving this candidate, and make sure that the recruiters are communicating with each other regarding the candidate. We are a team, and in my opinion, there's just no one person owns a candidate. Let's work together to make sure that candidate has a really great experience. And it does make sense to have one point of contact. So I would tell my team to, well, okay, why don't you take this candidate? You've talked to the candidate, you have the relationship with the candidate. Even if it's a role that is outside of a rec that they're working on, why don't you drive that candidate forward and, keep that one point of contact, and maybe the other recruiter could get involved and help share some nuances of the business that they support. Maybe they know a little bit more about the business, and they could really work together to make sure that candidate has all of that information. But the communication between recruiters is going to be key, to understand, hey, this person, we don't want candidates to receive multiple messages from different recruiters within a short time frame, right? So if it's been 6 months, a year, that the person has had communication like that, two-way communication with the candidate, still reach out to that recruiter to make sure that, hey, anything I should know about this candidate before I give them a call. And I love what you said, Chris, about responding to recruiters, because you really do never know. You never know about layoffs coming up, or something might change. It makes sense even to have an exploratory call, just to say, hey, why don't we just have a call? I'm not looking right now, but I'd love to hear what's happening in the industry, happening at Amazon or other tech companies, and just get to know that recruiter. And that way you do have that relationship that you're building over time. And it might be a year or two before you really start looking, but at least you've started building that relationship.
No, I love that. Those exploratory calls were awesome. Like that was one of my favorite things when I would have like an exploratory call. And I know they're not looking for right now, but like you said, anything could happen, especially in this market. My goodness. So anything
Mhm.
could happen at any point in time, but it was a good way to just establish a relationship, establish some sort of a cadence. And I could follow up with you every 6 months or so just to check in, because again, you never know what's going to happen with that. And so, yeah, I mean, I've always liked kind of having those exploratory conversations, and even if you're not ready, now keep in mind, again, we're salespeople. So some recruiters, especially if they haven't quite hit their goal yet, they might be a little bit more pushy than others, right? But it's totally up to you to actually understand kind of where you're at and if you're ready to interview. Maybe you are in a place now where you are actively looking, but you still need time to prepare. Don't let a
Mhm.
recruiter pressure you into interviewing, right? There's always a good response that I think works quite well, is just let them know. I was like, listen, I'm absolutely interested in this position, but I'm not ready just quite yet. I'm going to need about 3 months before I'm fully ready. It's like, I might be able to pass the interview right now, but I'm not here just to pass the interview. I want to do great on this interview, right? If you let
Mhm.
the recruiter know that, that pressure is going to be taken. I was like, okay, I totally get it. I want to make sure that you're coming in and you're doing the right thing. I know for myself, I would actually make people pause in their interview process, like you need to go study, right? It's one of those things, you don't want to jump in the ring to box if you haven't actually practiced yet, right? You want to get some
Yeah.
training in. You want to go back through the elite codes. You want to get back to practicing how to interview, and getting comfortable in that space again. Maybe do a couple of other interviews before you attempt this Fang interview, because again, you've got to get yourself in that comfortable space, because interviewing, in itself is very uncomfortable. I mean, you're nervous. There's a lot riding on this, right? This is your career. You spent your entire life dedicated to this craft. You spent time and you spent money to it. There's a lot riding on it. And we can't help ourselves than to be excited and nervous and panic a little bit, right? But the more you put yourself into those situations, the better you're going to feel in that interview. So don't be afraid to push these interviews off if you need to. Now, sometimes you might miss out on an opportunity if it's there, but ask the recruiters, like, hey, are you hiring a bunch of these types of roles right now, or do you just have the one? Right? Gathering some of that information will help you understand. It's like, okay, is it worth making take an attempt now, or should I actually prepare before I actually get into this interview? Because I would rather you take a couple of months to prepare for this than go into the interview and fail it, because then you
Yeah.
have to go down the cool down period. Now, that's changed. Like back in the day, I knew it was like a year. We could make some exceptions for like a 6 month case, but every company's gonna be a little bit different. What was it like there at Amazon for that?
So if someone failed the interview, could they come back and interview? Or, well, I'll say on the timing perspective, I would encourage candidates to take several weeks to prepare. And it takes a while to schedule these interviews as well. So don't rush. Just take your time. If you need 3 or 4 weeks to prepare for the interview, take that time. And so that way you're set up for success in the interview. There have been times where candidates have failed the interview, and I shared a little feedback. A lot of companies don't necessarily share specific feedback, which is tricky, but I would give them a little something, say, hey, this is an area of opportunity for you. Why don't you go out there in your current company and start maybe getting some exposure into this other area, and then come back in a year and chat with us again and try again. And I've had candidates go out, learn a certain skill, and then come back and interview and get that position. Or say they were down leveled from, let's say, an L8 and they were offered an L7 position. I said, why don't you go get that skill? If you really are shooting for that L8, go get that skill and come back a year later and try again. So typically it's a year to interview again before you can try again. But I think like I said, just give yourself that time, make sure that you're ready, prepared,
Mhm.
practice. And I like what you said, Chris, about, going out there and interviewing. I think it's like public speaking. The more you do that, the more comfortable you're going to get. So the more you go through those practice interviews, the more successful you'll be in the real interview that you're targeting.
Absolutely. And one of the things you brought up, I want to kind of hit back on is like, like rejections, right? I mean, like providing feedback from a candidate, that's fantastic. You're able to do that. And you're right. A lot of companies won't allow that. And I would say this was a shift that's happened, I would say, over the last like 8 or 10 years. Unfortunately, we've kind of moved to a space where people don't handle rejection very well at all. And it's to the point now where instead of actually looking inward saying, okay, maybe I didn't do this right, it's the company's fault I didn't pass the interview, or like it's discrimination now. Like people go into these extreme links to like, why didn't I get the job, versus actually kind of inward looking and auditing kind of like their own interview and like, okay, this is what I did in the interview based on the body language. I'm not sure if this example really hit. You really need to look back and reflect on some of that, because we can't give a lot of feedback sometimes. There's too
Mhm.
much risk these days to give any feedback
Yeah.
back, because candidates can take it like to something as simple as, you didn't really convey your experience in this specific area quite well. Well, I did, and they would try to like argue with you the whole time. It's like at this point in time, like when you're getting the rejection phone call, like, there's literally nothing you can say to salvage it. Like at that point in time, it's about to be gracious, thank him for the
Mhm.
opportunity, and then stay in contact with that recruiter. Because when I was at Meta, my favorite people were to actually bring back in were folks who have failed the interview in the past, because they've
Mhm.
been through it. They know what's going to be asked. They've seen it before. And they all like almost, I would say about 80 to 90% of the time, the people who came back to interview passed the interview that time. And so I
Mhm.
always talk to those folks, and anybody who didn't pass my interview or maybe turned down the job, I still stayed in contact. Again, keeping that to ROE, because I want to build that network. I want to make sure that anybody who's engaged with in the past is able to come back to that. Rejections are hard. I mean, we've been doing this. I mean, I've been doing this for 20 years. I mean, it's never been easy. And those calls are not fun to have. So if you understand, like we're coming to a place like, listen, this is it is what it is. You did what you could do. Unfortunately, it just wasn't right at the right time. And it's you got to be gracious. You have to just accept it. Thank you for the time. Keep that relationship going, right? So just keep that in mind. So
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, absolutely. Leave on a high note.
Yeah.
And don't jeopardize that relationship, because that relationship is really important moving forward in the future. And yeah, I mean, we've hired people that didn't make it through the first time. They come back a year or 2 years later and they make it through that interview. They've built that skill, or maybe they've had more practice. Maybe they just had an off interview. They just struggled. They had some other things happening in their life and just wasn't focused on the interview. So several different reasons can lead to that rejection.
And speaking of like, weird things happening in an interview, I mean, I don't know why it just popped in my head, but again, keeping that relationship with the recruiter, if something goes weird in the interview. Now, this does happen where maybe,
Mhm.
if maybe the interviewer was not engaged, maybe they're eating a bowl of cereal. That's happened before, right? And it's like, they're not engaged, they're distracted. I've had some times where I've had the interviewer be completely distracted. Maybe there's like a Sev 1 issue that they're having to take care of and they're completely distracted in the interview. And it wasn't a good interview experience. And this is a real world example. This was for a what was it? It was for a just a network engineer, like a level 2 network engineer. Nothing really complicated, right? The candidate reached out to me after the interview was completely done, but like immediately right after, and let me know that he doesn't think this would be a good fit. I'm like, well, what happened? He's like, well, in this interview, they were asking me coding questions. I'm like, coding question? What do you? No, there's no coding in this interview. Like, what are you talking about? Well, I reached out to the team who did the interview and I was asking, it's like, hey, did you interview this candidate? Did you go through the questions we had? And we was like, yeah, I went through them. He said the candidate was talking about you started asking him coding questions. Like, yeah, we figured, down the future they would need to know how to code. I'm like, who told you to do that? It's like, well, we just
Mhm.
figured. I'm like, and they both voted no on the candidate. I'm like, why are they a no? And they're like, well, they weren't able to code. I'm like, that wasn't part of the interview. I'm like, what are you doing? Did they do
Yeah.
this? Yes, yes. They hit all the points they're looking for. I'm changing your votes to yes. If you do it again, I'm kicking you off the interview panel because that's unacceptable. But I wouldn't have caught it
Yeah.
in the first place unless the candidate came to me and let me know what was going on. Because we can get ahead of that before we have the debrief, get together with all the feedback. We can get ahead of those issues before that. So if you do run into anything wonky where you might want to bring that up at the rejection time of that, bring it up before we have that. Let us get ahead of it because once we're doing the rejection, again, nothing you can do is going to change that outcome. But if you get to us before we get to that because something went wonky, that's when we can intervene and we can help that out because we're as
Yeah.
recruiters, like our job is to control that debrief and making sure that the interview panel is doing everything legally, ethically, and keeping on point. There are a lot of times we have to steer the conversation because they're going off on a tangent that's the wrong way. It's like, no, 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 let's get back to what we need to focus on. Can they do this, this, and this? Right. And everybody's human. Everybody's going to make mistakes. We have unconscious biases that are going to happen in these interviews that they don't know that's happening. And so in these debriefs, sometimes we could pick up on some of that stuff and identify that before it could become an issue. And that's what our jobs are for, is to help that out. But again, help us help you at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Now,
Chris,
have you
actually
had
on
any of
that
those?
point, I love to debrief with the candidate and ask about the interview before the debrief with the interview team. So if there's anything unusual that came up that maybe wasn't part of the initial pre-brief or assessment discussion that I had with the interviewers, then I can be aware of that. And then I can be prepared in the debrief. Hey, that's part of the job profile. That's really not, we don't need that skill. So yeah, I have had times where interviewers have gone rogue and I'm like, what are you doing? And I've learned from the candidate, like, oh, they shouldn't be assessing you on this. That's not part of the job. So it's really important to share your feedback if anything unusual happens. That way we're aware of it and we can take that information into the debrief, but we could also provide maybe the interviewer needs more training. Maybe they need to take an unconscious bias training. Maybe they need a little heart to heart with the recruiter about what they can and cannot ask the candidate. So that's good knowledge for us down the road. So as
Yeah,
we're helping to prepare the interview team, not all interviewers, not all people are great interviewers. Now I know at many of the tech companies, they require training and X number of interview shadows before they can actually take on an interview, but sometimes they need additional help and training and education. And so that's helpful for the recruiter to know. And we'll take that offline with the interviewer and help, so that doesn't happen again. But I
absolutely.
love to debrief with the candidates. Like, what did you think? Like anything that was unusual, anything you didn't expect. It just helps me get a sense going into that debrief.
That's great. Yeah, and we take candidate experience seriously. Like, like we understand that this is your first impression of the organization, and that's something I try to instill in the training that I do for my hiring managers or anybody who's interviewing is, this person taking the time out of their day to interview with us. Like, we should show that same respect. We need to come in, ready for this, be excited that they're chatting with us. It shouldn't be just a browbeat. Like, do you know how to do this? Do you know how to do this? Like, no, you want to get to understand kind of what they can do. How does this
Mhm,
fit into the organization, right? There should be a right way to interview. And sometimes, yeah, you are going to get some of those bad eggs in there. And, again, you let us know, we can get ahead of some of that stuff. Awesome. So what I want to do now
mhm,
is kind of move into like behavioral interview. We're talking about, we talked about some of those core principles you'll see, at like Amazon, and almost all companies are going to have some sort of core principles when it comes to interviewing. It just look at the core values. I mean, you have the the leadership principles you have there. Every company has like core values, and we do look for some of those attributes in some of those interviews. Now,
mhm,
when it comes to behavioral interviews, now there are tons of different things. You mentioned the STAR method, right? So
mhm.
talk to me about your approach when it comes to like coaching a candidate on how to answer behavioral questions.
Mhm. Yeah. So as we talked about, it's like storytelling. So thinking about what are some really good, robust examples of where you've had impact or you've solved a problem. So thinking about the situation, what was the situation, the problem that you were trying to solve? What were your actions? So you want to make sure you're aware of, something that you actually did, like I did this, or versus hey, well, we did this, but what was your part in the action? What were the tasks involved? And then the results, being able to demonstrate quantifiable results with solving that problem. So being able to share metrics, percentages of how did you make that impact? Did you make things easier for the customer? Did you make things easier for your team? Did you remove inefficiencies? Did you increase operational excellence? By what percentage? So being able to demonstrate the quality of the work and also the quantity of what you've done and the impact.
I love that you said percentages because a lot of times, 'cause I see this a lot on resumes and sometimes in interviews. A lot of folks will talk about a dollar amount. The problem with dollar amounts, it's subjective. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
I'd say $100,000 at Bank of America is a penny in a hat, whereas that could be detrimental to a startup, right? So dollar amounts don't exactly matter. It's the percentages of like what kind of impact that you made. So I love that you brought that up, and you're absolutely right. I mean, when it comes to good behavioral interview questions, now when we say behavioral interview questions, these are questions that are asked about your past, typically in the form of like, tell me about a time when this has happened. If any interview question they're asking about a past story, that's a behavioral question that would use the STAR method. Now, I know there's several other like ways to do this, but we like talking about the STAR method because it's the easiest one. And believe it or not, the STAR method is the actual formula to telling any good story. I mean, think of this. I mean, like here's an example. Like the situation was a princess was trapped in the tower. The task was the knight was to save the princess. The action was he fought a dragon. The results was he was eaten by a dragon. You know, it's just a linear method of telling a story so that way the audience can understand. So when it comes to talking about these, it's about bringing that audience into your situation. The more that you could bring them in, they could actually show empathy, they could understand what you're going through, the better they're going to be able to understand what you're trying to convey. A lot of mistakes I see candidates do is they overcomplicate the situation and the task. I mean, the situation is just setting the scene of the story. What was going on?
Mhm.
What was the company? What were you actually working on? Keep it in layman terms as easy as possible. Anybody that you're talking to should be able to understand what you're talking about. But first of all, it starts off with knowing what are they trying to look for. Like, for an example, the tell me about a difficult technical challenge you faced in your past. Most people think that we're trying to find like the most technical thing they've ever done in their history, but I don't care about that. I just want to know, like, why was it technical for you at the time? Set the scene for me, right? It could be something as simple as you've never used containers before, and they're asking you to use Kubernetes for this, right? So it's something as simple as I've been working on this project. We decided to start using containers. I've never touched these before. right? A pretty simple task for the most part if you have experience with it, but that was the challenge. Like you didn't know how to use this, right? So walking us through like setting the scene, how did you actually get assigned? Like how did you solve that? What did you walk through that? The action piece the action results and finally the what you've done differently is the most important part of that. But people tend to focus too much on the situation and task that you lose your audience, right? So you have
Mhm.
to know who it is that you're talking to because sometimes using specific jargon, right? So if let's say I had a candidate I was talking to from Bank of America, and they were talking about writing software, and I couldn't. They kept using these acronyms and jargon. I had no idea what they were talking about. So you lost me complete in your story, and my ADD brain couldn't hold on to what you're talking about. So now I'm thinking about something else, which is not good, But he started talking about what was actually the software for the chips and the cards, right? But I didn't know any of that, right? So sometimes you have to break it down, and that situation piece is to help set the stage, is to bring that audience into your story so they could follow along as you give us those specific details. And a lot of times people miss that. Now, there's the
Mhm.
other side of that. So sometimes they'll ask, I mean, what I call like a process question, right? Or like a hypothetical. Instead of talking about like, tell me about a time when this has happened, they would do an example. It's like, well, what would you do if you were giving a task that a technical challenge that you've never faced before? How would you go through that? Well, that's just the action portion of your answer there, right? It's kind of turning it into that. Now, one of the things I love talking about is what if you don't have a story? So what would you tell a candidate like if they asked a behavioral question or story in their past, but they've never experienced that? How would you go about like answering something like that?
Oh, that's such a good question. Like, if you don't have an example, I mean, if there's anything that's similar, or if you can, it could be maybe it's something in your personal life that you could share, I guess. I don't
Okay.
know, Chris, like, that's a really good question because
It's tough.
most of the questions, there's some kind of example, like when you've had a conflict with, a colleague, how did you navigate through that when you've made a decision with limited data? That kinda stumped me a little bit, like, if you don't have an example, how would you navigate through that? What do you think?
I would say there's a couple different ways you could do that. I mean, I like the idea of like trying to find something that's similar to that, but you know,
Yeah.
there's a way to actually turn a behavioral interview question in a story into a process question of like a hypothetical,
Uh,
right? So, I mean, a lot of times, again, the conflict thing may actually come up. Let's say that maybe you've only been in your career for 2 years, right? At this point in time, you're still absorbing information. You're not pushing back on a lot of stuff because you just don't know enough yet. And if they ask you a behavioral question, tell me about a time you had a conflict with your manager and you pushed back on that. Well, nobody in 2 years is really going to have done that. Well,
yeah,
instead of actually about something you've done, make it a hypothetical and be honest with it.
yeah.
Just let them know. It's like, honestly, I'm still pretty new in my career. I haven't faced that kind of challenge before. However,
How I
this
would
is what
handle
I
it.
would do.
Yeah.
This is what I would do, right? So you would actually do you would turn was a start question into a process question and go through that hypothetical example. Well, the first thing I would do is I would seek to understand. I want to get the full story first before I make any assumptions going into this. Then I want to find out, okay, based on all the other missions I have, I still think this is the way to go. You bring data to the conversation. I'm like, have we thought about going this direction, right? And try to get feedback from that, right? But it shows a couple of different things if you're able to do this the right way. And it's tricky to do sometimes, but it's number one, it shows integrity. You're not trying to lie or trying to put a square peg in a round hole. It shows that you can think on your feet. I mean, you just got asked this question that you haven't faced before. How would you do it, right? And then secondly, regardless of not being in that situation before, now you've demonstrated you could handle it regardless of ever being into that. So, and it shows your ability to think on your feet, but also just the
Like your
experience.
potential, like how you would handle
Exactly.
that.
Exactly.
And yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about like someone earlier in their career, could be at university that they could think about an example. Maybe they didn't agree with like a peer, or could be in school, or maybe they're working on a project or an internship. They could think of an example there where they don't have that real world experience yet, but maybe there was a situation where they were part of like a project in school that they could pull an example from. But I love that, thinking about, hey, just be honest and say, hey, I haven't had that experience yet, but if I were to be have that experience, like this is how I would go about navigating through that challenge. So, I think in that situation, like we always want to think about examples from the past, but they don't have that experience. Like, how would they then maybe changing it over to the hypothetical?
Yeah, absolutely. And this really comes to another point of that is just preparing for interviews. I mean, this is something I've been doing for the last, oh my goodness, 10, 12 years or so. But I've been collecting interview data specifically for the roles that I've interviewed for. And these are interview questions and stories that I've kind of gathered throughout the years. I feel like I have a database of like 75 different interview questions I've been asked throughout my career. And this way I could best prepare for some of these answers. And the more, and you could even look up some of this stuff. I mean, even go on ChatGPT, like what are good behavioral interview questions for a data analyst, right? This is a good place to actually look at, see what are some of these possible scenarios you might be into. So this way you could start preparing what are some of the stories that you may have. I know for me, like when I'm nervous or like if I'm, things like that, I have a hard time, like my memory just doesn't work that way. I mean, I can't even like do an interview question. They ask me three at the same time, right? I have to write them down because my ADD brain will only catch the last question. I'll forget the first two, right? So you have to work
Mhm.
within what you can do. And a lot of these times it's hard to think of stories when you're under that pressure. And so it's important to go and write the interview questions down and then start coming up with stories that you've done in the past. Now, when you do this, like do not memorize a script. My goodness. That is probably the quickest way to get rejected by me is if you start reading a script to me. It's like, because you're not genuine anymore, right? We
Yeah.
want genuine answers that you do in the past. So when you're doing this, like write a storyboard, write talking points. I remember back doing public speaking, we used to use those flashcards, right? Even like on PowerPoints, you don't write your whole script, what you're reading there. You've got talking points and you go through it. Well, think of the same way when you're doing this, and you want these stories to be genuine, right? And then practice telling those stories over and over out loud. Record yourself, telling these stories so you could see what's hitting and what's not hitting. Like a comedian, he doesn't go up on stage and tells a joke he just thought of. No, well, I mean, improv maybe, but most of the time these are prepared stories, and they test them out and they get the timing right and they do other things. And the story's never told exactly the same, but it's a way of actually just conveying some of these stories, just having something prepared so you could follow along in your path for that. What tips do you have for folks to help prepare for some of these behavioral interview questions?
Yeah, I mean, I love your idea of just like thinking about the stories, writing some notes, some bullet points, examples. Like, that there's the standard behavioral questions, look them up, write a couple stories. And if you're interviewing for a company that has values, know that the values, the culture, the leadership principles, whatever, they're going to be tied to the interview questions as well. So focusing on what was your impact? How does it tie into the mission of the company, the values? Practice with people in your household, friends. The more you can verbalize that, you're going to be more and more comfortable answering those questions on the spot. And take a deep breath. Like, don't be afraid to have some just quiet space during the interview to say, okay, let me take a minute to think about that. And so you don't have to respond right away. It's okay to have some awkward silences. And most interviewers will say, hey, take your time to really think about the answer. Don't feel rushed or pressure at all. And what else? I think, you can practice with a recruiter too. You could say, hey, I'm thinking about different behavioral questions. Like, would this example be a good example to share in the interview? So definitely bounce that off of the recruiter to get their perspective. Like, we are your advocate through the process. We want to make sure you're successful. We want you to be comfortable in the interview and know what to expect. So please lean on your recruiter to help prepare you for the interview.
That's good. I love that. Like role playing is so crucial. Like, I mean, I'd probably say like I'm a pretty darn good interviewer. Like I tell great stories. I'm really engaging in the conversations. But even I have a role play buddy. Like if I've got an interview coming up, I've got new stories now. I've got new experiences, and sometimes I need to run those by somebody to make sure that number one, they understand what I'm talking about. Is it hitting the points that we're looking for? But also gives me a chance to practice while someone's watching me. And that's even like like speaking of someone watching you, I mean, just coding interviews. I'm not sure if you're like me, but if someone's standing over my shoulder while I'm trying to type, nope. I mean, I like my spelling goes out the door. I can't spell a darn thing. Everything just goes, goes a little haywire. But if you're in a coding interview and you have that anxiety of someone watching you, the best way to do it is have someone stand over your shoulder. I mean, I used to coach candidates when we used to whiteboard interviews and in-person interviews. I would tell them like practice whiteboarding interviews while someone's standing over you. Having them watch you do that helps you put yourself in that situation there. So I love that. Like the role playing, that's a
Yeah.
great idea. I mean, you gotta practice these things, and it's important to make sure that again, you can't recreate an actual interview itself, but sometimes it helps. Now, this is probably going to get me in a little bit of trouble because this is something I like to do sometimes. The way my brain works and it comes to stories, like again, sometimes people are a little nerve-wracked. Sometimes you might have to have a notepad of just keywords to help you understand, okay, these are the stories I want to tell. Maybe even especially in the day of like remote interviewing, utilize your surroundings. I mean, I've had a couple of interviews where it's going to be a long interview day where it's a back-to-back interviews, and I want to make sure I've got my stories prepared. I use sticky notes. Like I've got a TV right here. I'd put sticky notes up on here, and I would have so if I'm in for like a manager role, like I would have Pip. I would have three names on there that I could recall back. It's like, oh yeah, here's a story. It's like, tell me about a time you put some performance improvement plan. I'm like, let me tell you a story about this, right? I can go right into that because it's like that's what because I know how my brain works. I just need that keyword to go, oh, okay, yes, here's that story. I can have that. And when I was doing in-person interviews, I would have my notebook just to help me kind of again keep me on track because my ADD brain, I mean, you have to work with what you got. And this is where it comes to those interview questions, like what is your weaknesses, right? And that's one of my weaknesses. Like it's being able to recall information like that while under pressure. And that sometimes I need to prepare, right? Or, I talk really fast when I'm nervous, so it's finding
Yeah.
ways to do some of that. So,
Yeah, and I
no,
would say, in your answers, make sure that you're really listening to the question and then you're answering the question. Because there might be some stories that you really are excited to share, but that's not the question. So just make sure you are really listening to that question. You're keeping your answers concise. I always tell candidates, like after a few minutes in the interview, kind of like read the body language. Like, is what you're saying, you can kind of, some people might not demonstrate any like body language. They might just have a very stoic expression and they're not really giving you a lot of that emotion. But most of the time, interviewers will say, yeah, yeah, okay, I'm like following, like take a step back and see if your stories are really resonating or the interviewers understanding what you're talking about. But remember to answer the question, even if there's other stuff you really want to share, you will have that opportunity likely to talk about those other stories, but stay focused, stay concise in your answer, and make sure you're being really articulate and clear in how you're describing your answers.
I love that. Yeah, you wouldn't believe how many times we'll ask interview questions. Someone trying to put a square peg in a round hole is like, that's not what I asked. Let's try this again. So if they have to ask follow-up questions, that might be a hint going, maybe you went the wrong direction with this one. Let's try that again. And if that is the case, write that down or at least take a note of it. So this way you could circle back with somebody. It's like, hey, this was the answer I gave to this interview question. Like, what do you think? But when you're actually taking notes during an interview, this also might be a good opportunity to push that feedback on the recruiter and during the rejection time because again they may not be able to give you feedback. It's like, yeah, I think I struggled in this interview. I'm not sure if I came across in the right way when I was doing for this for this interview question. Would that be what you heard, right? So that
Mhm.
might be able to give you a way to kind of like in a way of getting feedback without getting feedback. So
Yeah.
perfect. Well, awesome. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I mean, this has been a fantastic question. I've learned so much more about Amazon than I even knew. This information would have been great when I interviewed back, was my goodness, it was like 15 years ago. But it was an absolute pleasure having you on today. Great wealth of knowledge, and I look forward to working with you in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris, for the opportunity. And it was a great conversation. I think recruiters can really learn from each other as well. So being able to meet with you and I appreciate the opportunity to share.